In the summer of 1889, in the narrow, filthy alleyways of Naples, Italy, a disease was tearing through the poorest neighborhoods of the city. Cholera. It had already killed thousands, and it thrived exactly where poverty concentrated people together. Cramped tenements, contaminated water, streets that doubled as open sewers. The people who lived in these slums were called the Lazzaroni, a word that basically meant the wretched poor, the underclass with no land, no trade guild, and often no fixed address. And yet, in the middle of all that suffering, these same people were eating something that would eventually become the single most popular food on the planet. They called it pizza. And at the time, nobody outside of Naples considered it food fit for decent company. Today, the global pizza industry is worth more than $150 billion a year. There are more pizzerias in the world than McDonald's, Starbucks, and Subway locations combined. Roughly 1 out of every 8 Americans eats pizza on any given day. But the dish that now feeds half the planet started as something closer to an insult. A cheap, greasy, tomato-smeared flatbread that wealthy Italians were embarrassed to admit existed in their own country. To understand how something this humble ended up conquering the world, you have to go back a lot further than Naples. You have to go back roughly 3,000 years to a food that wasn't even called pizza yet and wasn't even really about the toppings. Flatbread itself is almost as old as agriculture. Ancient Egyptians baked flat rounds of dough on hot stones as early as 2500 BCE. The ancient Greeks made a dish called plakos, a flatbread topped with things like garlic, onion, and herbs. The Romans had their own version too, called pizza, a flat disc of dough baked and then dressed with oil, honey, or cheese. None of these were pizza in any recognizable sense. There was no tomato sauce because tomatoes didn't exist anywhere near the Mediterranean yet. What these ancient cultures had figured out, independently and repeatedly across thousands of years, was a simple survival technology. Flatbread was fast, cheap, required minimal fuel to cook, and could be topped with whatever scraps of food a household happened to have on hand. It was peasant food, in the truest sense. And for nearly 3,000 years, that basic formula barely changed. Then, in the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors returned from the Americas carrying a strange, bright red fruit that grew on a spindly green plant, the tomato, and Europe reacted to the tomato almost exactly the way it would later react to the potato, with suspicion, fear, and outright rejection. Botanists correctly identified the tomato as a member of the nightshade family, the same family as deadly belladonna, one of the most poisonous plants known to Europeans at the time. Wealthy Italians who could afford imported pewter dinnerware unknowingly made things worse for themselves. The acid in tomatoes reacted with the lead in pewter plates, leaching out toxic compounds and causing lead poisoning in anyone who ate them off fine tableware. People got sick, people sometimes died, and the tomato got blamed. It picked up a nickname across parts of Europe, the poison apple. For roughly 2 centuries, tomatoes were grown as ornamental curiosities in wealthy gardens and almost never eaten. Sound familiar? It's the same story that played out with the potato, just with a different vegetable and a different century. But there was one group of Italians who never got the memo about tomatoes being dangerous: the poor. In the region of Naples and the surrounding Campania countryside, peasants who couldn't afford pewter or silver plates were eating off cheap wooden boards or directly with their hands. No lead poisoning, no mysterious illnesses, just a tangy, acidic fruit that happened to grow incredibly well in the volcanic soil around Mount Vesuvius. By the late 1700s, poor Neapolitans had started putting tomatoes on their flatbreads, and pizza, in something close to its modern form, was born. But here's the detail that matters. This wasn't considered food, not real food anyway. It was street food, eaten standing up, sold by vendors who carried portable ovens through the alleyways, shouted their prices, and served pizza to laborers, dock workers, and the Lazzaroni who couldn't afford anything better. Visiting foreigners who wrote about Naples in this period described pizza with a mixture of fascination and disgust. One French traveler in the early 1800s called it a disgusting, foul-looking dough, deformed and baked as best as possible, blackened by the poor oil it was cooked in. Wealthy Italians from Rome, Florence, and Milan considered pizza to be beneath them entirely. It was, in the strictest sense, a food of the underclass, tied to poverty in the exact same way potatoes were tied to poverty in Ireland, and bread was tied to class status across the rest of Europe. That should have been the end of the story. A regional peasant dish, eaten by the desperately poor in one Italian city, forgotten by history the way thousands of other local foods have been forgotten. But in 1889, something happened that changed everything, and it happened for almost the exact same reason the potato finally got accepted in France a century earlier. Royalty got involved. King Umberto I and Queen Margherita of Savoy were visiting Naples that year, and according to the most widely repeated version of the story, the Queen had grown tired of the elaborate French-style haute cuisine that dominated royal dining at the time. She asked to try something local, something Neapolitan. The royal court arranged for a local pizza maker named Raffaele Esposito, who ran a pizzeria with his wife, to prepare a selection for the Queen. Esposito reportedly made 3 different pizzas, one topped with lard, cheese, and basil, one with tiny fish called cecchinielli, and one that used tomato, mozzarella, and basil, red, white, and green, the exact colors of the newly unified Italian flag. The Queen loved that one best. Esposito, either as genuine tribute or as a brilliant marketing instinct, named it Pizza Margherita in her honor. Whether every detail of this story is historically precise is still debated by food historians. But the effect was real, and it was massive. A dish that had been considered fit only for the gutter had just been personally endorsed, at least according to legend, by the Queen of Italy. Pizza had its royal seal of approval, the same kind of validation that took Frederick the Great and Antoine Parmentier decades of scheming to force onto the potato. Pizza didn't need scheming. It got lucky once in front of the right person. But acceptance in Naples is not the same thing as global domination. And pizza's real explosion happened somewhere else entirely, an ocean away, in a country that, at the time, had barely heard of it. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians emigrated to the United States, fleeing poverty, overpopulation, and political instability in southern Italy. Most of them settled in dense immigrant neighborhoods in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. And they brought their food with them because food was one of the only pieces of home an immigrant could actually carry across an ocean. In 1905, a man named Gennaro Lombardi opened a small grocery store on Spring Street in Manhattan's Little Italy, and he began selling pizza to the Italian workers in the neighborhood. Lombardi's is widely credited as the first licensed pizzeria in the United States. For decades, though, pizza remained almost entirely confined to Italian immigrant communities. If you weren't Italian and you weren't living in one of these specific neighborhoods, there was a good chance you had simply never heard of it, let alone tasted it. As late as the 1940s, pizza was still considered a strange, foreign, ethnic food by most Americans, the same way sushi or pho would later be considered exotic curiosities before eventually becoming mainstream. Then World War II happened, and pizza's fortunes changed almost overnight in a way that echoes a familiar beat in food history: soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of American troops passed through Italy during the Italian campaign between 1943 and 1945. They were stationed in towns and cities across the country, and many of them, for the first time in their lives, ate real Neapolitan pizza. They loved it. When the war ended and those soldiers came home, an entire generation of American men had a taste memory of Italy, and pizza was near the top of the list. Demand exploded. Italian-American pizzerias that had quietly served their own communities for decades suddenly found themselves swamped with customers who had never set foot in Little Italy before the war. The next 30 years turned pizza from an ethnic specialty into a full-blown American institution, and the transformation happened fast. In 1958, 2 brothers named Dan and Frank Carney borrowed $600 from their mother and opened a single restaurant in Wichita, Kansas, called Pizza Hut. 2 years later, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, a college student named Tom Monaghan and his brother bought a small pizza store for $500, and within a decade, it had become Domino's Pizza, built entirely around a radical promise: delivery in 30 minutes or less. That single logistical innovation, fast, reliable home delivery, would end up defining an entire category of American food culture for the next 50 years. Meanwhile, in 1957, a company called Celentano introduced one of the first mass-produced frozen pizzas to American supermarkets, and by the 1960s, frozen pizza had become a fixture in the freezer aisle of nearly every grocery store in the country. Pizza wasn't just a restaurant experience anymore. It was something you could keep stacked in your freezer for a lazy Tuesday night. By the 1980s, pizza chains were engaged in an all-out arms race for market share. Pizza Hut and Domino's were joined by Little Caesars, Papa John's, and dozens of regional competitors, all fighting over the same hungry American customer with gimmicks, deals, and delivery speed. The rivalry got so intense that in the 1990s, Domino's was hit with a series of lawsuits after delivery drivers, racing to beat the 30-minute guarantee, caused fatal car accidents. The company eventually dropped the guarantee entirely rather than risk another lawsuit, but the cultural damage, or arguably the cultural mythology, was already permanent. Pizza delivery had become inseparable from American life. Today, the numbers are almost impossible to fully picture. Americans eat roughly 350 slices of pizza every single second. That works out to about 3 billion pizzas sold in the United States every year. The global pizza market, when you count every country, every chain, every neighborhood pizzeria, is worth well over $150 billion annually. Pizza Hut alone operates in more than 100 countries. In Japan, you can order pizza topped with squid and mayonnaise. In Brazil, a popular variety is topped with green peas and hard-boiled eggs. In India, you can find pizza topped with paneer and tandoori chicken. The dish that Neapolitan street vendors once sold to dock workers has been localized, remixed, and reinvented on every inhabited continent. But here's where the story of pizza gets a lot less comfortable, because the modern pizza industry isn't just a feel-good tale of an immigrant food conquering the world. It's built on top of a supply chain with some deeply uncomfortable problems, and most people eating a slice have absolutely no idea about it. Start with the tomato. Most of the tomatoes that end up in pizza sauce, whether it's a chain restaurant or a can on a grocery shelf, are grown and processed in industrial-scale farming operations. In Florida, one of the largest tomato-producing regions in the United States, farm worker advocacy groups have documented cases of forced labor and modern-day slavery on tomato farms. Cases serious enough that federal prosecutors have brought criminal charges against labor contractors in multiple instances since the 1990s. Organizations like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers have spent decades fighting for basic protections, fair wages, and freedom from abuse for the largely migrant workforce that picks the tomatoes that eventually become pizza sauce on your dinner table. Then there's the cheese. Mozzarella production at industrial scale requires enormous quantities of milk, and dairy farming carries a significant environmental footprint, contributing to methane emissions, water usage, and land use pressures on a global scale. The cheese on a single fast food pizza doesn't just represent flavor, it represents an entire industrial dairy supply chain stretching back to feedlots and processing plants most customers never think about. And then there's the delivery workforce itself. The gig economy model that companies like Domino's helped pioneer decades ago has evolved into today's app-based delivery platforms, where drivers are frequently classified as independent contractors rather than employees, meaning they often lack basic protections like guaranteed minimum wage, health insurance, or compensation for vehicle wear and accidents. The same industry that made delivered hot to your door in 30 minutes a cultural expectation has also generated ongoing labor disputes and lawsuits over how those delivery workers are compensated and protected. None of this means pizza is uniquely evil compared to any other mass-produced food. Almost every global food industry, from coffee to chocolate to beef, carries similar structural problems once you follow the supply chain back far enough. But it's worth sitting with the contrast for a second. Pizza started as the food of the powerless, sold on the streets by people the wealthy considered beneath notice. And in its modern industrial form, it still runs, in no small part, on the labor of people with very little power at all. Think about the full arc here for a second. A flatbread technology that ancient Egyptians and Romans stumbled onto independently. A fruit that Europe spent 2 centuries convinced was poison. A dish so tied to poverty in Naples that wealthy Italians were embarrassed to admit it existed in their own country. A queen's endorsement, real or legendary, that gave it just enough prestige to survive. Millions of desperate immigrants who carried it across an ocean in their memories, because it was one of the only pieces of home they had left. A generation of American soldiers who fell in love with it in the ruins of post-war Italy, and a $600 loan from somebody's mother in Kansas that helped turn it into a multi-billion-dollar global industry. Pizza never asked to conquer the world. It was never designed, marketed, or engineered by anyone with grand ambitions. It survived poverty, suspicion, and 2 centuries of being considered unfit for polite company, and it did it one slice at a time, sold by people who just needed to feed their families and happened to stumble onto something the entire planet eventually couldn't get enough of. Not bad for a dish that started as an insult. If you made it this far, do me a favor and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite pizza topping because honestly, I'm curious, and I'll see you in the next one.